Queen City News reporter Savannah Rudisell joins us now with a closer look at the turnout here in the Tar Heel State. Savannah, good morning.
Hey, good morning, guys. Donald Trump carried the swing state for the third election cycle in a row. The Associated Press called the race in North Carolina just after 11 o'clock, hours before other states, which he and Kamala Harris focused on during their campaigns. Trump received nearly 2.9 million votes, while Harris gathered close to 2.7 million. That's all according to the State Board of Elections. This is really just a 3% difference. Trump won the state in 2020 over Joe Biden by just a 1% differential. In his early morning speech to supporters in West Palm Beach, Trump gave a special shout out to the state.
And in addition to having won the battleground states of North Carolina, I love these places, Georgia, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin.
More North Carolina Republicans turned out this year, while participation among Democrats dipped compared to 4 years ago. GOP voters slightly outnumbered Democratic voters in the early and mail-in voting period, but the leading group during that time in turnout was North Carolina's largest base, unaffiliated voters. Back to you.
All right, Savannah, thank you. And joining us now to continue to break down the election results, here we have Dr. Chris Cooper, political professor at Western Carolina University. Dr. Cooper, thank you for joining us this morning.
Good to see you.
Good to see you too. Look, you, like the rest of us, very short on sleep here, but what we were talking about as we were coming back from break, we thought that this morning that we'd be talking about what's going on in Arizona, Nevada, talking about, okay, what does the race to 270 look like? That's not the case as we saw Trump run away with this election. Are you surprised at all with what we saw?
Yeah, I am surprised. I'm not going to lie, right? So the presidency was a big surprise. I think the other state races went more like what we expected. The Democrats gained a seat on the Council of State. They held on to the one competitive congressional race. They broke the Republican supermajority. All that matters, but at the end of the day, the headline is and will remain Donald Trump won, and he looks like he likely won every battleground state. At the very least, we can say he won every battleground state that's been called thus far. That's a shocker. I didn't see that coming.
Well, Dr. Cooper, usually we see Democrats do well when it comes to early voting, and there was a lot of early voting record numbers, especially here in North Carolina. What, in your opinion, do you think went wrong from getting all those people out in the polls early to the general election last night?
I mean, part of it was that we saw a reversal in those patterns. So yes, early voting numbers were really good, but they're really good for Republicans. We actually saw a flip where it was Republican turnout that bested Democratic turnout in that early vote. The largest group of all three, though, I think it was just mentioned, was unaffiliated. So the big question I had going into election night was, how are those unaffiliated voters going to break? Are they going to go for Trump? Are they going to go for Harris? And I think we saw the answer pretty clearly. They went for Trump.
Dr. Cooper, as we look at the results, and you mentioned the independent voters there, looking at the past midterms, Democrats said, okay, women's rights, abortion, this is something we're going to push, and that is going to lead us to victory in the polls. And we saw that. They took the same strategy going into this election right there. And did they misread that compared to maybe the Republicans focusing more on, hey, we understand that times are tough, we're going to focus on the economy? Did they misread pushing women's rights versus the economy?
You know, I think they probably should have spent more time on the economy, or at least made a better case for why Kamala Harris was the right candidate for the economy. It's really interesting. If you step back a little bit, look at some of our other states, they actually passed some, so Montana, right? Pretty red state, voted for Republicans up and down the ticket. They actually voted to expand abortion rights and to codify that in their state constitution on the same ballot that they voted for the Republican candidate for U.S. Senate and voted for Donald Trump for president. So it looks almost like voters are willing to decouple those ideas. They have ideas and attitudes about abortion. They have ideas and attitudes about Donald Trump, and they don't necessarily connect those two.
And Chris, as we head towards January and everyone taking their new positions, what do you see happen? Because now we have President-elect Trump now and possibly control of the Senate and the House. What do you see, and how do you see that agenda going?
I mean, so yeah, it looks like he almost certainly has control of the Senate. The House, right, is still the question mark. If he were to get all three of those, in other words, if the Republican Party controlled all three of those, and they can essentially enact whatever policy within reason, within the bounds of the Constitution they would like. So Donald Trump at various times has proposed some real changes to the way that our government functions, to the way that civil servants, the kinds of protections that they enjoy or might not enjoy in the future, to what might happen to the United States Department of Education, to what might happen with some of our EPA and some environmental regulations. obviously to what might happen for folks who are not here legally. There could be a lot of changes on the horizon. Some folks are going to see that as positive, some as negative. I think everybody should pay attention, though.
Obviously, great point there. Everybody should pay attention. I do want to talk about state races in 1 second, but last point on Trump. We saw a former president sit through court cases there, be convicted of a felony, and we saw him win an election after having 4 years out of the office, return only the second president to do that. As a student of history, government history, somebody who teaches this, how do you even begin to break down this election, what happened, and the historic fashion that it happened in?
I mean, it is just wild, right? I mean, yeah, so the fact that you've got him coming back into office after leaving office, so he's voted out just 4 years ago. I think everybody sort of agreed that Kamala Harris was probably a better candidate than Joe Biden, but that still didn't prove to be enough. Donald Trump, the felonies, everything we talked about with Donald Trump, and none of it seemed to matter. None of it seemed to stick. It's like the laws and the ideas we think we have about how humans cast their ballot and how they behave and how they look at government. It's like we have everybody else, and then we got Donald Trump.
And when we talk about now going down the ballot, we do have President-elect Trump, but now we do have Democratic-elect Governor Josh Stein. Does that affect anything from the federal level to the national level here in North Carolina?
I mean, it definitely does affect state politics, and that Josh Stein winning, the Democratic candidate for governor winning, coupled with the Democrats breaking the supermajority. So what that means in reality is, yes, the Republicans still have the majority in the General Assembly, but Josh Stein's veto pin is now going to be one of action. It's one that he can actually veto laws, and if he just keeps the Democrats together, make sure that the General Assembly doesn't pass more laws. So in terms of the state government, I imagine we're going to see a lot of stalemate. Again, some folks are going to like that, some won't. In terms of the national government, the federal government, a lot less stalemate, probably a lot more action in the Republican direction.
Is there anything to build off of if you're looking at the state level? And I know that state-wise, Democrats typically do a little bit better in their state-run races in North Carolina than they do on the federal level. But if you're looking as a North Carolina Democrat there, is there something to build off as you start to look towards midterms saying, okay, we have to build off the success that we saw in the state run and try to maybe find a way to translate that to our federal races as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think they're going to have to work to do that. Obviously, there's maps that we have currently. You can argue about how they came about, but the reality is there's really only one competitive one in the whole state, and that's NC1. It's going to be very, very difficult in 2 years for the Democrats to gain any more seats than they already have in the United States Congress. Obviously, the presidency isn't up in 2022, so it's going to be about the General Assembly is kind of the main push, and then that U.S. Senate election, right, where we assume but don't know that Tom Tillis, the Republican, will run again, and we don't know who's going to face him. And so that's what the Democrats need to figure out next is who is going to be their horse, their candidate in that race.
But when you look at that, how do the Democrats determine who is that person that will start taking them forward? Because right now, I'm not sure of who that is when you look at that.
Yeah, I'm not sure who that is either, right? Obviously, there's some scuttlebutt about Roy Cooper. I'm not sure if Roy Cooper is in on that scuttlebutt or not, or if that's just the kind of thing that people talk about. Some folks have mentioned Michael Reagan, who's the EPA secretary up in Washington, D.C., that he might come back to North Carolina. They're going to have a winnowing out process, much like we see for the presidency. I mean, I think that is probably what the Democratic Party will soon be thinking about, and certainly what people are going to be speculating about. That is the next major election in the state of North Carolina, and really the only potentially competitive one at the federal level in 2 years.
Speaking of who comes up next for Democrats, as we look back now, we're playing Monday morning quarterback, right? Of course, where our vision is 2020. But did Democrats waste too much time deciding to pull President Biden from the ticket and put in somebody else there? Because Kamala Harris, she worked her tail off there, but she was working really much against the clock. Did they waste too much time knowing that this may be the way that the election shaped out?
I think it's possible they did, right? I mean, she was trying to run a campaign under circumstances we've never seen before, right? Donald Trump's been running a campaign for 8 years at this point, essentially. And Kamala Harris tries to introduce herself to the country, convince them to vote for her, convince them to turn out, all in a very compressed timeline. But I think the Democratic Party had kind of lost control at that point, right? I mean, ultimately, it was Joe Biden's decision. I mean, I think there are some parallels to what we saw in the gubernatorial race with the Republicans. Clearly, the Republican Party knew Mark Robinson was problematic early, but weren't really able to get rid of him. And I think the same kind of thing happened at the presidential level for the Democrats.
All right, Dr. Chris Cooper there. Thank you so much for your insight. I know that this is still a subject that we're going to be totally following, so we'll be speaking to you a lot later on as this goes forward.
Thanks for having me. Great to see you.